Hello and welcome back. I'm Adam with Push the Envelope, the channel that gives you everything artificial intelligence and machine learning. Today we're going to be expanding upon our Python knowledge and branching into what classes are. Now we just learned functions in the last video. We're going to take that a step farther and start looking at classes. You can sort of think of these as a mixture between functions and dictionaries. But let's stop talking about it and actually show you what they are and how we can use them. Alright, Jupyter Notebook is up and we are ready to go. Now, for those who haven't been following along, the link to my GitHub is at the very top of the screen. It's also in the description. But that's where you can find all of these templates and all of these solutions as well. Now, you don't necessarily need those to follow along, but they will definitely help, especially when we're looking at some of the example problems, having that text right in front of you. Either way, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to be looking at how to define classes and then a whole bunch of practice problems. So the class definition is fairly straightforward. To define a class, you just write class, and then you come up with some name for your class. In this case, for this example, I'm going to be creating a class that stores a bunch of student information, so I will call the class student. Follow that by an open close parenthesis, and then a colon. Now, just like functions, if statements, for loops, anything that ends in a colon, everything that you want to be in the class needs to be indented under it. So just make sure you're adding those indentations. But for this class, I'm going to add a couple names. So for instance, I'm going to add the first name of the student. We're just going to set that to Tom. The last name of the student, we're going to set that to White. And whatever year the student is in. So we'll say that this person is a freshman in college. Okay, so that's how you can go ahead and define the class. Now, when you want to use the class, you need to say, okay, I'm going to make my class named Tom, and it's going to be equal to student. Now make sure you put those open and close parentheses. And now Tom is storing the class. So if I want to get each of these individual values from Tom or from this class, all I have to say is print Tom dot first name. And if I print that to the screen, you can see Tom.firstName will grab the first name variable and print that to the screen. And I can keep going. I could say Tom.lastName and Tom.year. And that's just how we can reference each one of these different values within the class student. So it's a way of sort of like a dictionary where you can grab whatever the key is, in this case whatever the variable name is, and it will pass you out a variable. But classes go much farther than just what dictionaries do, so let's kind of get into what we can do with these. And the first thing that we really need to understand is the initialization function, or it's just shorthand for init. So I'm going to have the same class, so class student. Make sure you put those parentheses and that colon. But now we're going to have just one default parameter. That's going to be school. So everyone who is assigned this student class is going to have the school UND. Okay. So now that we have the school defined, we're going to define a init function. And it's really a function, if you remember from the last video, but it's executed as soon as you initialize the class. So our definition, it's a double underscore init followed by another double underscore. And now any function within a class needs to pass itself into it. And to do that, we're just using the keyword self. Now, our init function is going to take in some values that we choose. So for this case, when I define student, I want to pass it the first name, the last name, and I want to pass whatever year they're in. So everything we had in the last tutorial, or not tutorial, the last cell, excuse me, we're going to be passing down here, but we're going to be allowing the user to add in that information instead of having it default to whoever our student was. So in order to set those, I can say self. Now remember, self is just the keyword for the class. So I want to set self.firstName. So I want to set the first name variable of the class to be equal to the first name that I passed in. Same thing for self.lastName is going to be last name, and self.year is going to be year. Okay, let me show you what this actually means. So now when I define a class, let's say it's student1. That's my variable name I'm going to be saving this class as. But student1 is going to be equal to student. And this is how we defined it before with open and close parenthesis. But now what we need to be passing in is all of these variables that the init function is looking for. So now I can pass in Tom as his first name, I can pass in White as his last name, and I can pass in freshman as the year in college that he's in. So now when I print student1 dot first name, student1 dot last name, and student1 dot year, you're able to see all of those are now stored within here. I also can say student1 dot school, which is defaulted to UND, as we can see right here. Now, the reason we're using classes is because now when I have a second student come in, so if I actually copy these two lines again, and I move them down here, now I have a second student. So let's go ahead and change this to student 2, and I'm going to change all of these prints to student 2 as well. Okay. Now maybe I have Deshaun Jenkins. He is going to be a sophomore. Okay. So now I'm using the same class definition, so the same template for creating a student, but I'm using it for a different student. So I can just keep reusing this and keep defining new people with all of these different parameters within their definition. So as you can see, the names has changed, but the school hasn't because that's set to a default to begin with, and we don't change it within the init function. Okay, so now once a class is set, how do we actually change these? So in 1 year, when our student 1 has become a sophomore now, or this sophomore has become a junior, how do we update that? So let's look at that. So I'm going to have the same class. So class, we're going to be storing a student name. Our school is going to be equal to UND. We're going to be defining our initialization function. Remember, that's double underscore init double underscore. You always need to pass in self to functions. You're going to forget that. I forget it all the time when I'm using classes. But when you're making functions, always pass in self in order to update the class's variables. But again, we're going to be passing first name, last name, and year. And in order to reassign those, it's self dot whatever the variable name is. In this case, I'm going to say self dot first name is equal to first name. It does not need to be the same here, so maybe I want to save it as self dot first. It does not need to be the same as the variable name, so let me just continue on with that. So self dot last will be last name, and self dot year will be the year. Okay, so now I can say again, defining whatever the student name is. So let me say student 1 is equal to what I did before. So I'm going to actually just grab these two lines right here. So I have the same lines from before, student 1 and student 2. Now I did change the name from first name to first and from last name to last. So that's just the one thing I do need to update. But if I print this out, you can see we have our originals right here. One thing I can do though is right after I define the student 1, maybe I need to update some of his information. So now I can say that the student1.year is now equal to sophomore. Okay, I'm going to copy this print statement before and after so you can see the change. But before, he was a freshman, now he's a sophomore. So sort of like when we redefine dictionaries, we're just really using this key, which is the variable, and then assigning it a new value. And that's really how we're going to be using classes throughout all of this. Now, maybe I spelled this second student's name wrong. So now I'm going to say student 2 dot first is really equal to Deshaun with the W. And when I print that statement out after, you can see we have swapped the name. So again, just using sort of those key value pairs, but in this case, they're really just variables, to reassign those values within the function. Okay, or sorry, within the class. Now we're going to be looking at how do we define functions. So not only can you have all these variables, now you can actually make functions within the class so that we can actually start doing some of this stuff. So now if you remember before, when I was printing all of these things outside of the class, I could actually just make a function that prints it all for me. So if I have class student, instead of defining everything, I'm going to do my initialization function, pass in self always, but I'm going to have only first name and last name just to save some time here. Now I want to set self.first to be equal to first name, self.last to be equal to last name. Now, coming back outside, so no longer indented within the initialization function, I can just define other functions. If you remember, the initialization function is just a function. So if I can define another function, maybe called print name, always pass in self to your functions in order to reference your variables that you're using. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to print self.first, that's all I saved it as, plus a space plus self.last. Remember, every time you want to reference a variable within the class that's saved within the class, you have to use self.first, which is why you need to pass self into the function. If you're not using any values that are saved in the classes, you don't need to pass self. But most of the time, you're going to be needing to do it like this. Okay, so we're going to be printing this name, and let me show you how you're able to actually do this. So if I define student1, which is equal to student, and we're just going to be passing in those two. So maybe it's Tom White again. So passing in the first name and the last name. While before I had print student1 dot first and student1 dot last. You can see that's how we printed it before, but now instead of doing it that way, I can just say student1 dot whatever our function name is. So in this case, we called it print name. And print name doesn't take any variables. It's only self, which is automatically included in here. So we don't need to put anything with it. But it's just like a typical function call where now if I print name, it's just going to automatically do that for me. And I don't have to worry about typing all of this out, referencing each one individually. And you can do much more than that. So you can also have a, let's call it prefix. So pre. And this is going to just be pre plus a space plus first. And now what this is really doing is saying, hey, I want to pass something else in. So I want to say Mr. Right? I'm going to pass in that prefix called Mr. So now when I print it out, I can also pass in other things to the function and include the things within the class. So now we'll print out Mr. Tom White. Again, just different ways of being able to use functions and variables within a class. And so they're super powerful, obviously, because unlike a dictionary, now you can start mixing the things you store in it, not only variables, but other functions and other more complex things within the class. And it's just a template to be able to copy what I did for student 1 and do the same exact thing for student 2 and not have to retype everything out. Okay. So now let's talk about how do we use functions actually within the initialization function. So we still have our class called student. And we have our initialization function. We're going to be passing in self. We're going to be looking for the person's first name and the last name, just like before. We're going to be setting self.first to be equal to first name, self.last to be equal to last name. Okay, and then I want something like self.full name to be equal to self.combine name. Now, what is combine name? Well, we have not built combine name yet, so let's do that right now. Combine name is just going to be another function. So define combine name, passing in self. We're not going to be passing in any other variables here. We're just going to return self dot first plus a space plus self dot last. Okay, so let's look at what we're doing here. Our combined name is really just putting first and last together as one string, and it's returning. So what happens when we call self.combined name? Again, self.function name is going to reference the function within the class. So make sure you're using this self dot. But we're going to be combining the name and saving it as a new variable as soon as the function is defined. So if I have student1 is equal to student, again, looking for first and last name, let's continue to use Tom White. Okay. I can print student1 dot first, student1 dot last, and this is going to give me his name. But now, since I've defined that function, I can just print student1 dot dot full name. Now we have, if I spell full right, sorry. Now we have this variable called full name that automatically was assigned to the combination of the two. So we don't have to worry about calling the function because init already did for us. And we don't have to worry about adding it together in the outside like we did here. So that's just very basics of classes. And again, just like everything else, it really is going to come down to how often you use these and just constant repetition to work that muscle memory of how to use these. So let's go ahead and start working a couple examples here. And actually, it's just going to be one really big example. We're going to have a lot going on with it. So this exercise is going to be tracking an airman, let's say in the Air Force, and it's going to have a whole bunch of variables. So it's going to have his first name, last name, their rank, their spouse name, DoD ID number, and full name. Now, some of these are going to be passed by the user, some are going to be automatically generated, and some are going to be used within functions. So those are going to be all of our variables, but we're also going to have functions to combine the name like we did before. We're going to have update spouse, generate ID, and print info. So using all of this right here, and let me kind of scroll down so you can see all of it. See what you can come up with for a function and look at these variables. So for instance, spouse name is going to be an empty string, but DoD ID number is going to run the genID function. And the genID function down here is going to be randomly assigning a 5-digit number between 0 and 9 for each digit. So see what you can come up with, maybe take it piece by piece, and then come back and we will start to slowly work through how do we build out this entire class to store these individuals' information. Okay, hopefully you at least took a stab at it, and let us start working through how we can do this. So I'm going to define a class called Airman. And looking at everything on the top, we have a whole bunch of variables. So we have first name, which is an input to init. So let's just slowly make this, right? So define our initialization function. Our initialization function needs self. Our first name is going to be passed. So first name. Our last name is also going to be passed. So last name. And the rank is also going to be passed. So rank. Spouse name is going to be defaulted to an empty string. So let me close this init function for now. Spouse name is going to be an empty string. So two choices for this. You can either in the init function make spouse an empty string, or outside of it, it's just going to automatically be there. So I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to say my spouse is equal to empty string. Okay. DoD ID number is going to be using a function, and full name is going to be using a function within init. So let's go ahead and save those variables. So self.first is equal to first name. Self.last is equal to last name. All right. We're going to do the same thing for the rank. So self.rank is equal to rank. Now that will give us the first four variables. We have this DoD ID number, and then we also have full name. So self dot, let's go just call it ID, is equal to the function self.genID. Remember, this is going to be a function. We have to say self in order to reference it within the class. And then we also have self.fullName. And that's going to be equal to another function, self.combineName. Okay. So let's define these functions that we don't have yet. As you can see, there are 4 of them, but let's start with combine name. So define combine name. Always pass in self if you're trying to use any variables within the class. So we're going to need that in this case. And then we can say self.fullName. Well, actually, we're going to be returning it to an int. So we're going to be returning self.first plus a space plus self.last. Okay, so that's going to return back to the initialization, and it's going to automatically store that as self.fullName, so we don't need to worry about storing that within this definition. Okay, next one we need to do is to define genID. Again, going to take self. Now in this case, we probably don't need self because I'm not actually going to be using any features within the class. I'm actually going to be returning them, but it doesn't hurt to pass self, so I'm just going to do it anyways. Now, I am going to be using a for loop in order to create this random number. So it needs to be a random list of 5 numbers. A random number of 5, length 5. So I am going to be using the random package. So import random. If you remember from the last video, we used this to generate dice rolls and stuff for the magic 8-ball. If not, you can just kind of follow along here. But in order to use random, it's random.randint. So for random integer, and then you give it an upper and a lower bound. So in this case, I need numbers from 0 to 9. Okay. So that's what I'm going to be using, but I need to store that into a, I'm going to use a string. So I am going to have ID be equal to, right now, just an empty string. Then I'm going to use a for loop. So for x in range 5, because I need it to be 5 numbers long. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say ID plus equals. So we're going to use string math here. I'm going to add the string of whatever that random number was. So we're going to go through 5 times. So it's going to add 1 number to the end of this all the way, and we're going to get 5 numbers as this ID number to pass back. After we have that, all we need to do is return the ID back to an int, and it's going to save it as self.id. Again, we don't need self within this function because we never used any reference to any variable within the class, but that's fine. I'm just going to keep it there just to get in the habit of including self. I'm going to save some space, remove some on there. Okay, so that is going to take care of everything within the init function. So just to test this out, let's say airman1 is equal to capital A airman. And we need to pass it in the first name, so let's continue on with Tom White, and maybe he is a captain. Okay. So now I just want to go ahead and print all of this stuff out. So we have airman1. Actually, let me make this an. I have airman1 dot first, and I'm just going to print all of his information out. So I'm going to copy this and keep going down the line. So we have first, we have last. Let me keep scrolling down. Maybe before that, I print out their rank. I also have their ID number. I have their full name as well. So before that one, I have their full name, and I also have their spouse. Okay. Printing all this out, you can see all of that information is stored. The very last variable here, you can't see it because it is actually an empty string. So, but it is there. So now we need to just do these last two functions. So we do have a function called update spouse, and it's going to accept a first and last name for the spouse and assigns it as a complete string. So first space last. So let's go ahead and define that. So define update spouse, pass in self, and we're just going to accept first and last name. And then we're going to say self.spouse is equal to first plus a space plus last. Okay, let's look at how to use this. If I run this code again, you can see nothing has changed. But now if I say airman1.update spouse, and spouse is going to be looking for first and last. So let's say Betty White. Okay. Let me make sure that this is capital. Okay, so now if I run it, coming down here, you can see now the spouse's name is Betty White. So Tom White and Betty White. Cool. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to type this out every single time I want to see the person's name. So let's go ahead and actually just make this a function within the class as well. So we're going to define print info. And we're going to include self. We're not going to pass it anything. But what we're going to do is we are going to print self.fullname. That's going to give us the full name of the person. Let's also print self.rank. We're going to print self.id. And we're going to print self.spouse. Let me make sure I put that as a print. Okay, maybe I should add some headers as well, so I can say name. The next one will be rank. The next one will be ID. And the last one will be spouse. I would just say spouse name. Okay, getting rid of all of these print statements now. Now all I have to do is call that function. So print info. And you can see all of this is now printing for us just in one call to the function. So again, just different ways of using classes. This is kind of end-to-end solution of what you can do with it. But the biggest thing with this is just for Airman 1. I could copy this down here. And I will make this Claire Underwood. Maybe this person is a, let me just do shorthand. Tech sergeant or something. And now I have Frank Underwood, and I print this out. So actually I just reassigned it accidentally. I need to change this to Airman 2. Okay, but now you can see if I print a divider here, that's \n. You can see I'm using the same template, but storing all of this information separately, so that you can actually reuse the template, but for multiple people. So you're going to see this a lot with storing information on people or places or something that has a lot of data associated with it, but also a lot of function calls as well. So that's going to be it for this video. Again, very quick intro to what classes are. You can definitely do a lot more with them, but for a beginner view, this was a decent overview. So I will see you in the next video, and thanks for joining.